It's always a great pleasure to introduce people who have served in the military armed forces of the United States. And I have a great opportunity and the pleasure today to introduce you to Mike Berry. Mike Berry is a lifer in the Navy, 29 years, from 1970 to 1999. Mike joined the Navy right out of school at the height of the Korean War and served until almost to the turn of the century. He is a native of Washington County, Johnson City, and he did come home to find a mate, and his wife Becky, who's a native of Kingsport in Sullivan County. So here's a merger of a type right here. Becky, believe it or not, served also in the Navy for 23 years. These two people together have got more stripes than the average zebra. Mike served on a number of different ships, destroyers, cruiser, and on the Missouri, which was one of the last battleships commissioned in the Navy before it was retired. They both served in various roles in the Pentagon and other naval centers. And one fact for the day, the only fact perhaps that I have, is the Navy has more people deployed overseas than any other branch of the military service, particularly in the Pacific, which is where the Chinese and the United States seem to be rubbing against each other pretty significantly. Anyway, the subject today is the taxpayer's Navy, and Mike has done an extensive study of the ships that the Navy has commissioned, operated, decommissioned, or sold to other people between 1950, at the beginning of the Korean War, and 3 years ago, 1920, when he closed up the books and put all this together in a tome here that will create a hernia if you try to carry it by yourself. In any event, please give us a very warm welcome.
The budget in 2020 for the United States Navy was $205 billion. Of that, $60 billion was operation and maintenance of all facilities, which to some people is probably a lot of money, to most people, I guess. But if you think about it and break it down, in 2020, the taxpayer spent $70 billion on lottery tickets. $80 billion.
Could you hold the mic?
Are you unmuted? Did you unmute?
I thought I did. Oh, it got tired. How's that? All right. Anyway, $80 billion on tobacco products and $100 billion on beer in 1 year. So $60 billion to operate the Navy is probably pretty good return on investment. World War II began, the Navy had 345 combat ships. Back then, combat ships were combat ships. They were offensive weapons that would go anywhere in the world and operate. They didn't count amphibs, minesweepers, all the smaller auxiliaries and stuff like that. Combat ships were combat ships. Today, combat ships, regardless of what you hear in the news, we have 192 combat ships in the Navy. When you look at before World War II, we had 345, today 192. The Pentagon will tell you they've got right at 300, maybe a little more. They're counting all the amphibs, the minesweeper, everything they can paint gray and put a hull number on. That's what they're counting. But they're not going to do what we need to do if we have to go to China. There's a handout on the tables that gives you a comparison of today's Navy versus the Chinese Navy. It's an eye-opening experience to look at. And that's what we know that the Chinese have. We don't know, they're not going to tell us everything. When World War II ended, the Navy had 802 combat ships. Of course, we needed a lot of combat ships during World War II in the Pacific. Over the years, they decommissioned a lot of those ships. Back then, when they would decommission a ship, they would put it in the shipyard, overhaul it to a like new state, and then put it in mothballs. Put it to sleep, basically, where they could keep it for future use. And a lot of those ships that they decommissioned and put in mothballs back then, they brought back during Korea and Vietnam. And they served a useful purpose. Today, we don't do that. When we decommission a ship, we scrap it or sink it. The pictures that are on the tables, the first ship there is the Kitty Hawk. There was a total of the last 8 conventional carriers that the Navy had. They sunk one as a target for training. The other 7 they sold for a penny. And you're looking at probably 30,000 tons of recyclable metal in each one of those ships that the Navy, they didn't want them, got rid of them. All the carriers today are nuclear carriers, nuclear powered, and we only have 11. We had 32 of those during Vietnam, conventional carriers. Today we have 11. They're much more sophisticated and capable ships, but the world hasn't gotten any smaller. You got 11 ships, and like Ken was saying, something happens and 3 of them are sitting in port in Norfolk. You don't have anything in the Atlantic or the Med, either one. It's a scary thought. Battleships, we talk about battleships for a few minutes. Oh, the last carrier that they built, nuclear carrier, $13.1 billion to build it. And they're building 11 of those. Battleships, I'm sure all of you remember when Reagan was in office and brought back the battleships and was pushing toward a 600-ship Navy. Well, by the time Bush left office, which was his vice president, the Navy got to 594 ships. And then the Soviet Union collapsed and we got rid of everything. But the battleships, they brought them back. 4 battleships cost $1.9 billion to bring back 4 ships. That, if you divide that by 4, the cost to bring back one of them would build 2 guided missile frigates, which there's no comparison in the capabilities of those ships. During the Vietnam War, they brought back the New Jersey briefly and sent her to the gun line in Vietnam. And she was there about 6 months, and the peace accords were going on in Paris. The North Vietnamese delegation walked away from the peace table. Until you take the battleship off the gun line, we won't be back. It was that effective. Of the combat missions flown in Vietnam, we lost 1,067 ships, or aircraft, flying on targets that were in range of 16-inch guns. That's a lot of money wasted on pilots and aircraft. There's no defense for a 16-inch battleship gun. I was on the Missouri, recommissioned her in 85 or 86. We went to the Gulf in 87 when Reagan reflagged the Kuwaiti tankers. And we were the first ship to escort those tankers through the Straits of Hormuz. And it was a night mission. We had practiced for weeks to get ready for it. And we had deceptive lighting, which we were going to go through at night. So we put the lighting on the ship that made us look like another merchant ship going through with the rest of the convoy of tankers that were going to go through that night. we started through, there was a aircraft off of a cruiser that was escorting us in. He was up spotting, and the silkworm sites along the Iranian coast there started lighting up. He was picking up information that they were bringing their missiles online. And he called the ship and had us turn on our 16-inch fire control radar, which there's no other frequency in the world than that. And as soon as we turned it on and everything got going, they turned the lights out and went home. They didn't want nothing to do with those guns. The thing that a lot of people don't understand about those ships, and they're gone, there's no way to bring them back now. They've made museums out of them. I've been on 3 of them, but they've made museums out of them and cut spaces up to where, they have auditoriums in them and everything. 70% of the population of the world lives within range of a 16-inch gun. And now they're gone. The only option that the Marine Corps has for support is a Tomahawk missile at $2 million apiece. They're spending a lot of money for nothing, in my opinion. Nuclear aircraft carriers, I'll get back to that. Nuclear aircraft carriers spend 30% of their time in a shipyard because they're so complicated. During the push to build nuclear carriers, Congress directed the Navy that they would have 1 nuclear cruiser for each carrier. So the Navy went to work building nuclear cruisers, very expensive ships. They decommissioned all of those early. Normally ships, when you build a ship, it's the last 30 years is the basic life of a warship. The Nimitz class carriers are going to last 50, and the current carrier they're building, it's supposed to last 70 years, which I don't know why you would build something that lasts 70 years, then you don't know what it's going to be like as far as battle space then. But when you decommission the ship early, we paid for that ship to be built. So if you pay $1 billion for a ship to be built, it's supposed to last 30 years. If the Navy decommissions it in 20 years, you've lost 1/3 of the life of that ship that you paid for. And it's astounding if you go through all the ships that the Navy has decommissioned early. There's a ton of them. Currently, the Navy's building Burke-class guided missile destroyers, and they're running in a range of about $1.8, $1.9 billion apiece. The problem with these ships is that they've crammed everything into one. Sonar, ASW operations, anti-submarine warfare, anti-air warfare, all into one ship. Years ago, you had specialized ships that were ASW ships or AAW ships, and they had that mission within the battle group. Today, they're sticking all that into one ship, and I question how good that's going to be when you have more than one mission to do. How can you do that and do it effectively? There are currently, 73 Arleigh Burke class ships. Like I said, the latest one cost $1.8 billion, and it costs $56 million a year to operate. The Navy constructed 4 destroyers for the Shah of Iran back in the late 70s, and we're going to sell those to Iran until the Shah got deposed, and so the construction company was stuck with them, so the Navy bought them. And we paid a chunk of money for them, and then decommissioned them early, of course, all of this was driven by the Soviet Union falling apart. And Congress and the Navy decided we don't need all these ships. So that cost us money. They sold those 4 ships to Taiwan, and you can go on Google Earth and find them. They're still active in the Taiwanese Navy years later. Guided missile frigates, pretty much the same thing. We built 61, I think, Oliver Hazard Perry class frigates through the years. Decommissioned most of them early, of course. We sold 20 of those to other countries. 16 of them are still active in those countries. And those countries have upgraded them to the best standards that they could do based on the information they have. That's something the Navy refused to do. Didn't want anything to do with them. So we come along to the point where we're building littoral combat ships. Now, a lot of people probably haven't heard of those. They're pictures 11 and 12 in the handout. Littoral combat ships were what I call plug-and-play ships for computer guys. They designed the basic ship, and the Navy's plan was to have modules that they could sit on the ship and plug it in to do an air war and a surface war, mine warfare, you know, whatever they wanted to plug into it. That was all a failure. The ships, under their current configuration, aren't even capable of defending themselves. And they've just recently developed a mine warfare module that can go on there and hopefully be successful to conduct minesweeping operations. Well, we've constructed 24 of those so far, and there's 8 more under construction, and they've already started decommissioning them early. It makes no sense. We're building them, but we're decommissioning them. You know, it's crazy. Those ships cost $50 million a year to operate. And why is that? They're a small ship. Because when the Navy wrote the construction budget for those ships, they built in that the contractor would do all the maintenance on the ship and not the Navy. So that drives up the cost considerably. Nuclear submarines. I know I was here when the commander of the Greenville was here, and I talked to him for a few minutes. He's on a Los Angeles class submarine. They've decommissioned 18 of those early. And the reason the Navy gives, they can't afford to refuel them. Most nuclear ships, when they're designed, if it's going to last 30 years, the fuel in that reactor will be good for 15 years. Then at mid-life, they refuel it, and it's good for the rest. Same with the Nimitz-class carriers. They couldn't afford to refuel them, so they parked them in Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, and that's where they sit until they get cut up. The current class that they're building is a Virginia-class ship, and according to the commander, the Los Angeles class has longer legs or can go farther underwater than a Virginia class. But those ships are costing $3.2 billion a piece per submarine. Nuclear submarines are very expensive. The biggest problem with nukes is the personnel are highly trained that operate those systems. And they're expensive to train and to keep. Because if you're trained to work on a nuclear reactor, you're pretty sharp. And you can get out here and get a job and have a lot less stress than serving on a ship. Ballistic missile submarines. The Navy has 14 of those currently in commission. Only 10 of them are ballistic missile subs because of the SALT agreements with Russia. Over the years, we decommissioned a lot of the older subs because of the SALT agreements. which cost the taxpayer about $68 million in funding. The money that we lose is not adjusted to inflation. The money that we lose when they decommission that ship is based on what we paid for it the year it was built. So if you add inflation into that, you're getting into some big bucks. The current class that they're building to replace the Ohio class is the Columbia class. And it's estimated to cost $15 billion a piece. And it's all about mission in those ships. The quietest ship in the world, can go anywhere in the world, and you never know it's there until it fires its first missile. I hope that never happens. The worst part about the whole program is if you own a car and you never change the oil in it, how long is it going to last? That's what's happening in the Navy. In 1950, the Navy had 11 public shipyards. Today they have 4. And if you go back and look in history, the shipyards, private shipyards in 1950, there were a bunch that built Navy ships and serviced Navy ships. Today, the surface Navy is 30 to 40% behind schedule in routine maintenance on ships. And what's that do? If you don't change the oil in your motor, it's not going to last 30 years. So when you don't do maintenance on the ships, that causes problems in the longevity of that ship. In 1990, the Navy had 23 repair ships, submarine tenders, destroyer tenders, and repair ships. Those ships took a lot of the load off of the shipyards because the ships that were going to go in the yards would have an availability with that tender, and that tender would do a lot of the work that the shipyard would have to do today. Today, there's 2 subtenders left. The Navy decided we don't need those. The surface, or what they call them, SEMAs, shore intermediate maintenance facilities, could take care of all that work. Well, so the Navy decommissioned all those tenders except 2. The problem with the SEMA is the ship's got to be where the SEMA's at. The tender can go. I was on a tender. We deployed to the Mediterranean for 3 months and sit in one place, and ships would come to us and we'd work on them. Or we'd fly teams to wherever the ship was. SEMAs can't do that. They're a fixed facility. Anyway, after they just decommissioned all the tenders, then the Navy decommissioned the SEMAs. You know, it's an excuse to do this, They decommissioned the SEMAs, and now all the work is contracted, most of the work is contracted to private contractors. Small jobs that the ship don't need to go to the yards for, they're done by contractors. The annual operating cost for one of those ships in '96 was about $70 million a year. And the Navy didn't want them because they were too expensive to operate. Well, they were expensive when you look at what some of the other combat ships cost to operate. But if you look at what benefit they were providing to the fleet, they were well worth that money. The 2 subtenders that are left, which is unusual to me, they're both in Guam, and there's only 4 submarines in Guam. So it's like, let's put them over here out of the way and out of sight, out of mind. Deferred maintenance. A lot of times when a ship goes into the shipyard, they'll find other problems that weren't evident when the ship was going into the yards. So they defer that maintenance if it's non-critical. And sometimes they defer maintenance that probably should have been done, all because of money. When you defer maintenance to the next yard availability, that adds 20 to 30% to the cost of that job. Recently, I read where the Nimitz had 26 water tanks that were condemned, fresh water tanks, because they didn't do maintenance on them. Today, there's one black powder magazine, or one black powder production facility in the United States. Black powder is used in everything explosive. For one way or another, it's there. Most of the time, we buy that from friendly nations overseas. Aircraft production. In 1950, there were 8 companies that produced aircraft for the military in this country. Today, there's 3. Major surface ship construction. 1950, there was 8 shipyards constructing ships. Today there's 2. Not counting the submarines. Surface ships, there's 2 facilities, 2 companies manufacturing. Missile production, 3 companies produce 90% of the missiles that the military uses. It's some staggering numbers when you really dig into it and look at where it's going. For several years now, Congress has asked the Pentagon for an audit, and they're still waiting. It's like the money goes in and you don't know where it goes. Any questions?